Basic Brewing Radio is brought to you in part this week by Beer Brains for iOS, the anti-social beer app. It's free. Justin, the developer of Beer Brains, is a longtime home brewer and listener of this podcast. He wrote Beer Brains because he couldn't find what he wanted in a beer app, so Beer Brains was born. Here's what Beer Brains does. It helps you create a wish list of beers that you want to try. So next time you're at the beer store or setting up a trade with somebody, you have a handy place to list what you're looking for. And you can store your own personal ratings and unlimited tasting notes. And important for those who have extensive beer collections, hello, Andy Sparks with your magic beer fridge, you can create an inventory of the beers that you have on hand. And the wish list, ratings, and inventory all work offline. So these lists appear instantly even when you don't have a good internet connection. But when your device is online, you can search for beers by name, brewery, or use the built-in barcode scanner to quickly get details for the beer in your hand. And with the latest version of Beer Brains for iOS, Untapped ratings will appear with the details of each beer. And when you want to be social, you can share beer info on social media or messaging. Check out Beer Brains for iOS on the Apple App Store or beerbrainsapp.com. It's free. Beer Brains for iOS. Welcome to Basic Brewing Radio for Thursday, May 28th, 2015. I'm James Spencer. Here at Basic Brewing Radio, we're all about home brewing. This week, Chris Colby of beerandwinejournal.com joins me to talk about feeding big beers. If you want to boost the alcohol of certain beer styles while keeping your yeast happy in the fermenter, feeding them added sugar is one route to try. If you're new to home brewing and would like to get into the hobby for the first time, check out our website, basicbrewing.com, where you can find archives of our audio and video podcasts and our DVDs to walk you through basic and more advanced brewing techniques. You can follow me on Twitter. My username is Basic Brewing, all one word. We also have a Basic Brewing Radio and Basic Brewing video page on Facebook, facebook.com/basicbrewing. We're on the Google Plus as well. Thanks to everybody who's clicking on the Amazon.com associate link on our basicbrewing.com site. Whenever you think of Amazon shopping, think of us first. Click on our associate link on our website, basicbrewing.com. It'll take you back to Amazon where you can shop to your heart's content. It won't cost you any extra. You'll be helping us to bring you the show. We greatly appreciate your support. We also have associate links for Brew Your Own magazine and the American Homebrewers Association on our site as well. You can find our Basic Brewing iPhone app on iTunes, our Android app on Amazon.com. We have a Windows Phone app. We're on the BlackBerry Podcast Directory, and we're on the Stitcher app as well. If you want to put a tip in our tip jar, some coinage in our guitar case, you can go to basicbrewing.com/support. Thanks to everybody who's done so already. And this is the last show before we go into our annual June break from posting Basic Brewing Radio episodes. Of course, along with vacationing, we'll be traveling to San Diego to attend the National Homebrewers Conference. I'm very excited about that. Of course, we've lined up a bunch of what we call interviews while we're there. I'm so excited I can't talk. So there's going to be a lot of work going on as well as enjoying the homebrew and the conviviality. Is that a word? And we're looking forward to meeting a lot of you. So if you don't see us in your podcast feed next week, don't panic. But you may see an episode of Basic Brewing Video in June, so look out for that. Speaking of which, I posted an episode of Basic Brewing Video earlier this week. In it, Steve and I finally tapped into my Maibach, which has been lagering and resting in my kegerator since February. I brewed it in middle of February. Did the long wait pay off? Did it turn out okay? Check out the episode to see. Let's take a look into the mailbag, shall we? You got an email from Matthew in Tucson, Arizona. Matthew says, I got a rhizome about a month ago from a friend. 2 vines took off, but have recently slowed, only growing inches over the past few days. 2 of the other vines have just gotten to the height of the planter and then stopped. Could this be a sunlight issue if I have been giving them afternoon shade? I don't want these poor fellows getting scorched when it gets up to 110 degrees Fahrenheit. But I guess it won't be an issue until June or July. Speaking of which, what actually causes yellowing in the heat? Is it sunburn or lack of water? For this one, I called in an expert, Dan Detmers from Gorst Valley Hops up in Wisconsin. Dan says this is fairly common, especially among the high alpha hops, Nugget and Magnum, and probably nothing to worry about. The first year, that rhizome's primary job is to grow a giant root mass and not to give you cones, so it will shoot up enough green material to get photosynthesis going, and then spend time growing root mass underground. Just give it a little fertilizer and plenty of water, and eventually it will take off again. Dan says, the shade is fine. I've seen our plants go somewhat dormant with temperatures breaking 95 degrees Fahrenheit, so your heat may be a factor, too. The yellowing on the leaves could be from stress due to heat. There you go. Thanks, Dan. Dan's up in Wisconsin, which is a great environment for growing hops. I would imagine it's going to be pretty tricky to grow hops successfully in Tucson, but it's worth a shot. What the heck? Good luck, Matthew, with that. Aaron from Schenectady, New York writes, inspired by one of your low-gravity rye beer experiments, I brewed the following, pitching it onto the yeast cake from a pale ale using White Labs 001. It really turned out great. The taste and mouthfeel are not at all what you'd expect from a 2.5% ABV beer. It's very refreshing, and the Citra hops give it a nice tropical fruit flavor. So Aaron, here's Aaron's beer. The stats on Aaron's beer: the original gravity was 1025. The final gravity was 1006. That gives it 2.54% ABV. The fermentables he used, and I'm sorry, these are all American measurements. 0.8 of a pound of American Pale Two-Row. That's 44% of the grist. 0.6 pounds of American wheat. That's a third of the grist. And then 0.4 of a pound of American rye. That's 22% of the grain. So a bit of a two-row, wheat and rye. Hops. For hops, he used 2.5 grams of Citra, boiling for 60 minutes. 2 grams of Citra at 10 minutes, and then 10 grams of Citra at flame out. So that sounds very tasty. The rye, as I found with my 100% rye beers, and then my my rye and wheat only beers, the rye really adds to the body of these low gravity beers, and it lets them be satisfying as well as low in calories and alcohol. So they are very tasty, and it's not like you're drinking a 2.5% beer. I'm thinking my next batch needs to be something similar, something low gravity, because my last batch was a Belgian-inspired brew with an original gravity of 1083. So I'm going to need something to balance that off. And that batch of beer, that Belgian, was brewed with my electric brew-in-a-bag system from High Gravity Brewing in Tulsa. Desiree and Dave from High Gravity are ongoing sponsors of this podcast, as you know, and longtime friends. And they now have 3 different versions of their electric brew-in-a-bag systems on highgravitybrew.com. They have a 240-volt 10-gallon system with a pump, which is what I have, a 120-volt 5-gallon system with a pump, and a 120-volt 5-gallon system with no pump, in the true tradition of brew-in-a-bag. You can see all of those at highgravitybrew.com, and you can use the options on the website to customize your system. For example, if you already have a pump at home that works just fine, you can choose not to order one. And you can choose what length of cable that you need. For example, Dave set me up with a cable that is long enough that I can brew in the kitchen or outside on the patio. And I love the EBC SV controller, which lets me set strike water temperature and mash temperatures electronically, so I can do other things to get ready for the brew and not have to worry about running back to babysit the kettle every now and then. And I love not brewing with propane. So you can see Steve and me demonstrating my system at youtube.com/highgravitybrew. And be sure to visit highgravitybrew.com, where you can get flat rate shipping of $7.99 on most items. highgravitybrew.com. Okay, let's talk to Chris Colby of beerandwinejournal.com about feeding big beers in the fermenter. Chris Colby, welcome back to Basic Brewing Radio.
Hey, James. Thanks for having me on the show.
It's been a while, but you've still been writing stuff on beerandwinejournal.com, and lots of good information. If people haven't been there lately, you need to go there and check out what's been going on. And one of the latest series of articles that you've done is brewing a big beer, but having an approach to brewing a big beer such that the fermentation continues and you get a possibly bigger beer than you otherwise could have. What's the concept that we're talking about here?
Well, the idea here is that the usual way you brew a big beer is you make a wort of a high original gravity. You pitch a bunch of yeast, and that'll drop the the original gravity down to some low, hopefully some lower level, and then you get your alcoholic content is the original gravity minus the final gravity, and that's the basis of how strong it is. The idea behind this, which I just call feeding, is that you start at a fairly high original gravity, and probably specifically if you look at yeast manufacturers, descriptions of different yeast strains, they usually give a top, an ABV not to exceed. And so you would start with a wort that would be projected, given that yeast strain's attenuation, you would make a wort that would be expected to produce a beer of that intensity or that alcoholic content. But then what you would do during the fermentation, you would keep adding little bits of sugar while the fermentation is not at the peak of fermentation, but not completely died down either. Sort of mid, when it's chugging along pretty good. Keep adding little bits of sugar to the fermentation and bump up the what you might think of the virtual original gravity. The original gravity head, you added all that in the beginning, and what you can do is you can push a yeast to produce a beer of a higher alcohol content than you could by just doing it the normal method, just making a strong wort to start with and then letting it go.
So it's more of the sugar concentration that is the ceiling, and not the poisonous effects of the alcohol concentration that's slowing down the yeast from doing that just by throwing all that sugar in initially.
Right. When you brew very big beers, there's a couple reasons why the yeast stop at a certain point, and alcohol is one of them. There are limits to what you can do with this. But the initial sugar content is another one. When you have a lot, a very high sugar content initially in the beer, that puts some stress on the yeast. And by the feeding, you take a little bit of the sugar stress part out of the equation, because the beer, it starts fermenting, and it goes, and when you're feeding it, the beer is maybe at if you started at 12, or at an original gravity that would yield a 12 ABV beer, you're maybe feeding it when it's at like a 6 to 8% ABV, based on sugar that's remaining, although the alcohol is actually, higher. The idea is you just keep the sugar content low, or lower than you would by doing it the normal way, because that is one of the stresses on the yeast is osmotic stress by sugar content, and there's the stress of having a high alcohol environment is still there, but you've taken another one of the stresses away, so you can bump up the alcohol level of beers, at least a little bit. I've heard one person claim to have got a beer up to 25% ABV. I'm not 100% sure I believe them, but I know I've done it, and gotten at least a couple, given my initial and final gravity readings and how much sugar I added. If the equations for calculating alcohol content work, at that level, then I've eked out a couple percentage ABVs above what the um, the stated limit of the yeast strain was.
Now, how do you figure that out? How do you figure out the final alcohol content? Because you can't. It's not just an easy thing of taking your initial gravity and then and then subtracting your final gravity and then figuring all that out. You're adding sugar along the way, so that makes it more complex.
A little more complex, but the thing is, your final gravity is still going to be your final gravity, and then all you need to do is you've got your original gravity of that before you started adding sugar. All you need to do is go to your like recipe formulation software and just add in all the sugar to the calculator. Just basically formulate the recipe as if you brewed it with all the sugar added at once. And then that'll give you your virtual OG. And then you do, OG minus the FG divided by whatever that fudge factor is that gives you alcohol content.
Speaking of sugar, what is the food, if you're feeding your yeast, what is the food that you're adding in there?
Well, this can be kind of interesting. When you feed the fermenting beer, you need the sugars you're adding to be fairly concentrated. Because if you added, say, a dilute sugar solution, you'd be adding sugar, but the water in it would also dilute your beer, and you'd be defeating the purpose. So the sugar you add needs to be dissolved in water such that it's very, very highly concentrated when you add it. So that sort of rules out all grain wort. But a very, very obvious thing to do would be to take malt extract and just make up a very thick solution of malt extract. Because if you add a small amount to the beer each time. So if you had like a 5-gallon batch of beer, the most you would be adding of sugar at any time, you might add like a quart of malt extract and water together, and just mix it up, heat it to 170 to sanitize it, cool it back down, and then stir it back in. So malt extract is one possibility. Another possibility is if you're making a big beer and you're trying to bump it up, maybe all you really want is to bump up the alcohol level and not bump up the final gravity to have because the final gravity is already going to be fairly high and the beer's already probably going to be fairly sweet. And so you can also just use corn sugar or cane sugar. Just dissolve that very, very thickly in a solution, and it might take you a little while to stir and get all the sugar dissolved, but then dissolve it, heat it up to sanitize it, cool it down, and stir it in. And so basically malt extract or sugar, or you can use honey, you can use basically any sort of sugar that you can dissolve into water is fine. But malt extract and sugar are going to be the two, or maybe honey would be the three candidates that the people would choose most of the time, or should choose most of the time.
Now, what's the difference between honey or table sugar, say, and malt extract? I mean, why would malt extract have a different effect on the final gravity of the beer than something like honey or table sugar or corn sugar?
Well, malt extract has it would probably be, if it's brewery grade malt extract, it would be mostly maltose, and then there'd be a little bit of maltotriose, and then there would be just a whole bunch of other carbohydrates that are slightly longer chained than like maltose, which is a two sugar sugar, and maltotriose, which is 3 maltose units. They're longer sugars that are not fermentable by yeast. Whereas if you add either corn sugar or cane sugar, it's either going to be glucose or sucrose, which is completely fermentable by yeast. And if it's honey, it's what's in honey? It's like mostly like fructose, I think, and fructose, glucose, and sucrose, or it's simple, whatever it is. I'm not sure. It's simple sugars, and basically going to be 100% fermentable, whereas malt extract is a mixture of, it's mostly fermentable sugars, it's mostly maltose, but there's you know, a smaller amount of unfermentable sugars in it. So adding malt extract when you're feeding a fermentation is going to bump up both the virtual OG and the actual FG, the final gravity. But whereas if you add sugar or honey, it'll boost the virtual OG, but the final gravity, presuming that the yeast consume all the sugars, will not move.
For the same reason that you don't want to, or you want to try to avoid doing a high gravity extract only beer, it might wind up thick and syrupy at the end of it. A lot of times when a home brewer, hey, this is my first, high gravity beer, and they're an extract brewer, and they give it to you, it's like, yes, well, yeah. That's why it's beneficial to add some highly fermentable sugar into the recipe.
Yeah, it's a little bit sickly sweet. It's it's the same idea why a Belgian triple has a fair amount of sugar in it, because it's a strong beer, but yet they want the body not to be not a thick body and not a cloying sweetness. So yeah, you can, and certainly when you brew bigger and bigger and bigger beers, I think generally most people's tastes run towards, people, there is a nice thing about a big full body and all that, but there's a point where it just becomes too much, just too chewy, too syrupy sweet. And so on very large beers, most people that brew them try to make a highly fermentable wort, and part of the way to do that is by using some percentage of your whole grain and sugar bill being something that's 100% fermentable.
Now, if you're feeding your beer, if you're feeding your yeast in the fermenter with honey and these simple sugars that don't have a lot of nutrients for the yeast in the substance itself, do you have to think about adding yeast nutrient at the same time?
You should, because you're going to have a high alcohol environment. You've got yeast that are already, have the stress of brewing a high alcohol beer, and here you're trying to push them to brew a very high alcohol beer. And so a little bit of yeast nutrients are a good thing. The flip side of that is that you're adding the sugar. This is you add it typically after high krausen, at the most vigorous part of fermentation. And if you add too many yeast nutrients late in the game, you sort of set the stage for having a nutrient-rich beer that's going to be vulnerable to contaminating microorganisms. So what you want to do is add only a tiny amount of yeast nutrients. You basically want to figure out how much yeast nutrients would be the minimum amount you would add just to ferment that little bit of sugar. Like, think about it, adding it to, if you're adding a quart, think about it, adding just enough to ferment that quart. Like, don't add the amount that would be required for a 5-gallon batch, because most of that's already been fermented. And then in a lot of cases, you might, depending on how much you're pushing the fermentation, you may be adding 2 or 3 or more different separate additions. And I would say if things seem to be going pretty well, the fermentation's chugging along, and you come to your last feeding, if things go, maybe don't add the nutrients in the last one, just to keep you from having a beer. It's good to have a wort that's nutrient rich, because the yeast are going to take those in and have a healthy fermentation. But having a beer that still has quite a bit of nutrients in it is not a good thing from a stability standpoint.
So what are some other hazards if you attempt this? I mean, what kind of trouble can you get into?
I would say the biggest one is if you don't run your initial fermentation well and you start adding sugar, you can end up with a beer that's just sickly sweet. The yeast might just conk out at some point. You've got to sort of monitor the fermentation as it goes, and you're uh, depending on the yeast strain and how high you're pushing the alcohol content and all that, you're sort of at the limits of what the yeast can do, and so you really got to take it not so much as following the recipe, but just sort of watch the fermentation. And like the first time for the first feeding, if you add it and it perks up a little bit and seems to be going pretty good, and then dies back down a little bit, and you add the second feeding, if that time it doesn't seem to perk up so much and it seems to be struggling, that might be your key. Even if you had planned a third feeding, you're at that point you might want to either just ignore the third feeding altogether, or you might even want to add sanitize a little bit of water and add it to the. Hang on, I'm sorry, the cat just kicked the earphones out of my head. Stop it, animal. Yeah, thank you, Flannery.
You're like Daniel in the Lion's Den, only on a very, very small scale.
On a small scale.
I might keep that one in there.
Yeah, sure. So anyway, getting back to what I was saying, you might even want to make your third addition, but have either less or no sugar in it, just to bring, because the sugar additions you're adding are going to do two things. They're going to be adding sugar to your beer, but they're also going to be adding volume. So when you start, you're going to make, if you're a 5-gallon batch, you might hypothetically brew 4.5 gallons to start with, and then figure that through the feedings you'll bump it up not only in ABV, but the liquid that comes with it, you'll bump it up to 5 gallons at the end. And you've got to, in the article on Beer and Wine Journal, I tell you how to do that. It's not really that hard. You just have to plan ahead.
And what do you have to, since this is a big beer and the yeast is working hard, do you have to pay extra attention to temperature of fermentation at this time?
Oh yeah, with any big beer, the fermentation is going to be what makes or breaks it. And you definitely need to pay attention to the pitching rate. You want to pitch enough yeast initially to have a good ordered fermentation with your initial wort. And that takes not only raising enough yeast but aerating it thoroughly. I would even, in most cases, if you're going to start at a fairly high a wort that's designed to make a high alcohol beer, at or near the limit of your yeast strain. So I would even in those cases, given that what's coming, aerate once thoroughly, pitch the yeast, let it go for about 8 hours, and before high kreuzen comes, hit it with a second shot of aeration before you reach high kreuzen, just to give the yeast a little bit more oxygen. And then yes, watching the temperature is definitely something you need to do, because on a high gravity fermentation like that, the temperature can ramp up pretty quickly, and you need to, especially in the run up to high kreuzen and right around high kreuzen, you need to be able to, you have to have some plan to cool down the fermenter at that time in case you need it. And then, later on you'll want to hold the fermentation at a steady temperature, probably, given it's a high gravity fermentation, you'll probably want to hold it somewhere near the low end of where the yeast is comfortably, or in the low end of where the yeast can comfortably ferment. And then at the very end, you might want to let the temperature run up, towards the top end, or even a little bit over, for the yeast just to finish off at the end.
Sort of like a diacetyl rest?
Sort of, but more like just when the last like 2 or 3 gravity points need to be ticked away, just extra heat to keep the yeast going, because the colder it is, even within the range of where the yeast ferments, generally the cooler it is, the more likely they are to just at one point decide to flocculate and drop out of solution. And for the absolutely biggest beers, like on this, I recommend, because I give an example recipe, that at the final little bit, you let the fermentation raise a couple degrees, and also either swirl the fermenter or take a sanitized, something that you can get down in the carboy or bucket, and just stir it once to rouse the yeast and get that last little kick of activity from the yeast, and finish it off.
What yeast strains are going to be the most reliable in this case?
Basically, any of them that are used for high gravity beers to start out with. I mean, you could use a sort of more moderate, a yeast with a more moderate alcohol tolerance, and then push it a little bit. But I mean, in that case, why not just pick a more highly alcohol tolerant yeast and do it the normal way? So you're probably, if you're making these sort of beers, you're going to be shooting for a very big beer, like something beyond the normal, even the normal big barley wine range. So pick any of the strains that would be good for barley wine, or there's that lager strain that they use for like Santa Claus clones. Probably one of my favorite ale strains all together, but also to use on high gravity beers, is just yeast 1056 or White Labs WLP 001 is the one that's similar to it, and there's the Fermentus USO5 is one of the dried yeast. I think there's some other dried yeast of the same basic, they call it the Chico strain or whatever. Those yeasts, are generally made for fairly neutral American style ales, and that yeast does well in high gravity fermentations when you treat it well. Big pitching rate, lots of aeration, enough nutrients, and that yeast will easily go beyond its stated the top range, which I think at least they used to list it as 12%. I don't know if they've revised that upward, but it used to be things I used to see published about it were that it could ferment up to a 12% beer.
Yeah,
which is big.
I've used a on my fruitcake barley wine, which is a small batch. It was about 3 quarts or so, and I pitched a whole packet in there and shook the heck out of it. And I think that it was a little like maybe 12.6% alcohol or something like that is what I figured. And it didn't seem to have a problem with it at all. It seemed to formulate, in a fairly straightforward manner. So that surprised me at the time.
It's a fairly powdery strain. It doesn't clump up and flocculate hard, drop out early. So it tends to be pretty good. What's the West Mall strain too? I guess yeast 3787, and there's a White Labs equivalent. But it's I think yeast calls theirs high gravity Trappist. That's a really good high, given the name.
Yeah, I think they recently changed it from Trappist to Monastery. I think that's the 500, the White Labs 500.
Yeah, and that strain anyway. That strain is really interesting in that you can make a lot of different kinds of beers from it. It makes good high gravity beers, but it's sensitive to pitching rate and aeration. If you bump up the pitching rate and aerate a lot, it makes fairly clean beers. But if you lower the pitching rate a little bit and maybe aerate just slightly less than you should, although the pitching rate's actually the main variable there, it makes more sort of estery, quote unquote Belgian-y beers. But that's a really good strain for high gravity beers. The Scottish ale one is 2, that's used a lot. Most of the just plain old English ale strains are pretty good at high gravity fermentations.
So when you're formulating a recipe, what are some tips that we've got to think about? How do we plan this beast?
Well, what I like to do is first drop the beer as if you're going to brew it just the normal way. Just everything goes thrown in the kettle or the mash tun, and so formulate it that way first, and then figure out what your overall alcohol level is going to be. Look at what the attenuation on your yeast is going to be. So how big is the gravity drop going to be, and then calculate your alcohol from there. And then what I would do is take you've got to make the batch smaller initially than you formulate it, because you're going to add stuff. So like if you're making a 5-gallon batch, you might want to make a 4.5 gallons. So just start by just lowering the volume, but leaving all your ingredients the same. So now you've got a recipe for lower in volume but higher in sugar and hops, and there's a stronger in every way beer formulated. And then just subtract out the sugars that you're going to use to feed later till you get down to a gravity that you can start fermenting at pretty well. Like for a lot of those yeasts, I would say 12%, an original gravity equivalent to a 12% ABV beer, given the attenuation of the strain. Start there, and then just basically rig it so that the sugar additions that you add later add not only the sugar you want, but replace the volume that you subtracted out before. So if you cut the initial wort down to 4.5 gallons, have one way you can do it has 2 different 1-quart additions that bring your ABV up to what you want, and also bring the volume up at the end. Because when you add the sugars, they're going to reinvigorate the fermentation somewhat, but not really. It's not really going to go nuts, because it's already mid fermentation. It's already chugging along, and the amount that you add at each little point isn't really a ton. It's not like you take half the wort and add like a whole nother half of the wort and have it just go nuts. You're adding enough to maybe bump the alcohol up by 1%. So it's enough that you'll see a burst in the fermentation, but it's not going to be the sort of thing where you add the sugar and then a couple hours later like foam is spraying out your airlock, that kind of thing.
If it is, send that in for a disaster show at the end of the week. So you depending on the yeast strain and depending on the conditions, you kind of have to eyeball it as far as the when to add the thing, and kind of get a feel of catching the yeast at the proper moment.
Yeah, I would say plan your beer very, very carefully. Plan exactly what you want to do, but then, given that you're pushing the limits, be prepared to be flexible given what the reality is. Like the example recipe I give, which I call JM Ale, is for a 14% barley wine. You start out making 4.5 gallons at 12%, 12% ABV wort, and there are 2 1-quart feedings that boost it up to, and that's pretty doable. That's you're pushing, especially if you establish a good fermentation starting with that's imminently doable. But if you were planning, a more ambitious one, like maybe you were going to try to make slightly less initial beer, but then bump it up to like 18% via, several additions, 6 small additions, you can start with your plan, but be very, very attuned to, when you add the extra yeast, come back a couple, hours later and see, how much added vigor has that added to the fermentation. And then when it dies back down and you add the next batch, come see that, are you getting the same amount of rejuvenation each time, or is it starting to fade? And when it gets to the point that adding sugar doesn't really, rouse the fermentation, that's the time to cut it off. And that's also why you add a series of small additions rather than, letting the fermentation like go to final gravity and then adding like one big, sugar addition, which you probably could do when you're not pushing too hard. But for the most part, you want to add the sugar in small doses so that if worse comes to worse and the yeast gets, relatively nowhere on it, you don't end up with, just a completely sickeningly sweet beer, because you've only added enough to boost the potential alcohol by 1%. And that's not going to be, it'll probably be enough that you might taste the sweetness, but it's not going to be overwhelmingly.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
So I'm thinking, big Belgian beers. This would be a good technique for. But what other styles do you have in mind for this technique?
Yeah. Well, I made sort of Santa Claus like beer a few years ago after I made my first couple like the Santa Claus beers the normal way. So a big lager is one possibility. Yeah, any of the big Belgian styles like a quadruple, or even if you're doing sort of wanted to make a quote unquote super triple, do that. English or American style barley wines are great candidates for this. If a super huge, very big Scottish ale, basically, I mean, you can just go through the BJCP guidelines, looking for what are the biggest beers, and say, I want to just ratchet that up one notch, and there's your list of candidate styles for that.
So is this is it a solid technique, or is it a stunt?
I think it depends on how you use it. You could treat it as, I mean, if you somehow just wanted to make just a monstrously alcoholic beer and that was your only goal, I mean, it could be more of a gimmick so that you could show up at a homebrew club meeting or something and say, hey, try this beer. It's, a billion % ABV. And in that case, it would be a stunt. But on the other hand, if you had if you like big beers and you just, you had, say, a big beer recipe that you liked and you just thought, I want to try to bump this up, just one or two notches from where it was and just see if I get, a little bit more, warming character in the beer, a little bit more, boozalicious. You could, it can be a good thing or it can be a gimmick depending on how you use it, how you, what the final beer turns out, what your goal is, and also your execution of the technique.
I like big beers, and I cannot lie. These other brewers can't deny that.
Well, yeah, there can be something nice in a especially like I don't drink a lot of American barley wine, but when I do, some of the bigger, just more alcoholic beers, they can be good when you're just going to have like, a couple, not, 4 or 5 beers that would just, put you under the table. But, having, if you're going to sit and sip something, it can be nice to have something with just a little bit more of that. Some of the biggest beers have some sort of element that sort of, start to get a little bit of a wine character from them from the higher alcohol, and that can be nice in the right beer if you've got everything else going on.
A wine made of barley.
A wine made
sort
of barley,
of
if you will.
Barley wine.
On the other hand, you could produce something that's just a god awful concoction of rocket fuel.
And drive home with it in your tank.
Yeah, you could use it for Molotov cocktails or something,
So it is up to us to use our brewing skills for good and not evil.
Mm-hmm. At least until you can get your hands on that new yeast strain that produces what was it? It produces heroin, something like that.
What?
There's a scientist at the University of I don't know, somewhere. They made no, it wasn't heroin. It was some sort of one of the opiates though. It's a beer yeast strain, and they put in a yeast that produces some sort of painkiller. And so the idea is they're gonna, instead of the usual chemical synthesis of this, they're going to have like a lot of drugs these days are made in fermenters. Insulin has been made that way for forever. But yeah, there's a yeast strain now that apparently makes and now I really wish I remember which drug it made. But
Oh, nice.
it's a yeast strain that's not going to show up in the Y Yeast or White Lag catalogs soon. If the yeah,
That'd be WLP 666.
yeah, yeah. You could the DEA would have like a chip inside every vial of yeast they sold of that.
And here we go again with homebrew legislation.
Yeah.
Oh, yeah. Talk about burying the lead. Well, very nice. I continue to look forward to articles on beerandwinejournal.com. And if you have questions for Chris, there's a comment section on every article. So let us know if you have brewed up some big old beers. Put it on the comments, and let's get a dialogue going.
Oh, and here's the answer. Actually, I used a tool on the internet called Google, and researchers have managed to reproduce the way poppies create morphine in the wild, but warn that the technology needs urgent regulation.
Oops.
Really?
Pandora's box has been opened, but
scientists warn that the findings could pave the way for opium poppy farms to be replaced by local morphine quote-unquote breweries.
Nice. So what's do you have to have do you have to have the raw material from the poppies to put the yeast into, or surely you can't just like use table sugar to make morphine?
I'm not sure. I'll have to read the actual. See, there's a link to the Nature article, but I don't know if I can read it.
Future article in Beer and Wine and Morphine Journal.
Yeah, here we go.
All right, Chris. While you're working on that, I'll let you go, and we will talk to you after the June break.
Yes, I will see you in, let's call it July.
Okay. Cheers, Chris.
Talk to you later, James.
Well, thanks again to Chris. You can see Chris's series on feeding big beers on beerandwinejournal.com. And you can also see an article from Chris on brewer's yeast and morphine production. Chris follows that one up with an opinion piece about the possible effects of this development on home brewing. So it's a very interesting read. Be sure to check out our sponsors, HighGravityBrew.com and Beer Brains for iOS. It's a brand new app from one of our listeners, Justin. Beer Brains for iOS. This is the last audio show that we'll post before July. And as I said in the beginning, we do have a video episode in the can, so I'm hoping I'll have time to post that before then. So stay tuned for that. In the meantime, if you have brewing questions, show suggestions, or just want to say howdy, write to james@basicbrewing.com, or just fill out the contact form on basicbrewing.com. And please don't forget to tell us where you're from. Check out our support link where you can throw a couple of bucks into the tip jar by subscribing financially to our podcasts. Be sure to check out our DVDs, Extract Brewing and Partial Mashing, Stepping into All Grain, Low-Tech Lagering and Decoction Mashing, and Introduction to Wine Kits. You can find them all on our site. You can check out the Basic Brewing shirts in the store as well. You can see a listing of the fine folks across the country who sell our DVDs on basicbrewing.com. If there isn't a vendor in your area, you can order them online in our online shop at basicbrewingshop.com. And we have you can get a free bottle opener with any DVD combo. We're continuing that deal. Got a new shipment of those openers in. And as usual, thanks to everybody who's continued to click on our Amazon.com link. Don't forget us in June. Just because we're off doing other things doesn't mean that, we're actually spending your money off in San Diego with plane tickets and stuff. So we need you to click on that link even more. Our products featured this week that were purchased through the link are Enchanted Castles 2015 Wall Calendar and Master Caster Giant Foot doorstop. Thanks again, everybody. And remember, I can't tell who bought what, so no worries there. Just click on the Amazon.com logo on our site the next time you feel like Amazon shopping. We greatly appreciate your support. Don't forget you can also join the American Homebrewers Association and subscribe to Brew Your Own magazine through the associate links on basicbrewing.com. That's all until next time. Until then, thanks for listening, everybody. I'm James Spencer, production help for Basic Brewing Radio, and our website is provided by Kelly Dodson. Basic Brewing Radio is a production of Active Voicing. We'll talk to you next time, everybody. Have a good June.